June 6, 1944 began like the end of the world for Waverly Bernard Woodson, Jr. The 24-year-old Army medic felt his landing craft shudder violently as German artillery found its mark in the pre-dawn darkness off Omaha Beach. The LCVP carrying the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion lurched sideways, metal screaming against metal, and then the ammunition stores ignited. Fire erupted across the vessel in a hellish orange bloom that turned the gray morning into an inferno. Woodson's body slammed against the hull as the blast wave ripped through the confined space. Shrapnel tore into his back, his buttocks, his legs, dozens of jagged metal fragments embedding themselves deep into his flesh. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot agony that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness. Around him, men screamed. Some burned. Others simply ceased to exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The cold shock of the English Channel swallowed him as the craft began to sink. Salt water flooded into his wounds, each wave of brine a fresh torture. But Waverly Woodson had not traveled 3,000 miles from his home in Philadelphia, had not endured the grinding racism of a segregated army, had not survived months of brutal training, only to die before reaching the beach. His hands found purchase on a piece of floating debris. His legs, though bleeding and weak, began to kick. The 320th was one of the few African-American units participating in the D-Day invasion. In an army that relegated most black soldiers to service roles, cooking, cleaning, loading supplies, the men of the 320th had trained as specialists in barrage balloon operations, deploying the massive silver balloons that would protect the invasion fleet from low-flying German aircraft. They were combat support, not combat troops. But on Omaha Beach that morning, such distinctions dissolved in blood and seawater. Woodson pulled himself through the surf, dragging his medical kit behind him. The beach ahead was a killing ground. Bodies floated in the shallow water, face down and lifeless. Men crawled forward on their bellies, seeking any depression in the sand that might offer protection from the murderous machine gun fire raking across the shoreline. The German fortifications on the bluffs above poured down a continuous rain of bullets and artillery shells. His training took over. Despite the shrapnel wounds peppering his body, despite the blood soaking through his uniform, despite the fact that he could barely walk, Woodson began moving toward the wounded. A young soldier lay crumpled 20 yards ahead, clutching his abdomen where his intestines threatened to spill out. Woodson dropped beside him, hands already reaching for sulfa powder and bandages. The first man he treated would not be the last. Not by far. As the morning wore on and the carnage on Omaha Beach mounted, Waverly Woodson, Jr. would begin a marathon of medical care that would stretch across 30 hours of continuous action. He would treat wounds that would make seasoned surgeons blanch. He would perform battlefield surgery with hands that trembled from exhaustion and pain. He would save men who had been written off as dead. But first, he had to stop his own bleeding. Working with methodical precision even as bullets whined past his head, Woodson bandaged his own wounds as best he could. Then he stood, swaying slightly, and looked across the beach at the dozens of men crying out for help. The German guns continued their terrible work. The tide brought in more landing craft, more soldiers, more casualties. Waverly Woodson picked up his medical kit and began to walk toward the sound of screaming. By 0700 hours on that 6th of June morning, Woodson had established a makeshift aid station in a small depression near the seawall. The location offered minimal protection, merely a slight fold in the beach topography, but it was enough to shield wounded men from the worst of the direct fire coming from the German positions on the heights. Artillery shells still burst overhead, showering them with sand and debris, but Woodson worked with his back to the enemy, focused entirely on the broken bodies before him. His own wounds continued to bleed. Each movement sent fresh jolts of pain radiating from the shrapnel embedded in his muscles. His uniform stuck to his body, stiff with drying blood, some his own, most belonging to others. But Woodson's hands remained steady as he cut away shredded clothing, applied tourniquets, administered morphine syrettes, and bandaged wounds that ranged from the superficial to the catastrophic. According to accounts later documented by historians including Linda Hervieux, whose 2013 book, forgotten the untold story of D-Day's black heroes at home and at war, chronicled the contributions of African American soldiers on D-Day, Woodson treated approximately 200 men during his marathon medical session. The number is staggering when one considers the conditions under which he worked. This historical research has helped establish the scope of Woodson's heroism on that brutal day. A soldier stumbled toward him, dragging a leg that terminated in a mangled mess where his foot had been. Woodson eased him down, speaking in low, calm tones as he worked. The morphine went in first, the blessed relief that would dull the worst of the agony. Then came the careful work of cleaning the wound, removing fragments of boot leather and sand, applying sulfa powder to prevent infection, and wrapping the stump in layers of gauze. The soldier would lose the leg, but he would live. Another man arrived carried by two of his squad mates. His chest bore a sucking wound, air bubbling through the hole in his lung with each labored breath. Woodson knew this injury well from his training at the medical facility in Australia, where he had been among the first wave of medics prepared for invasion duty. A sucking chest wound could kill in minutes if not properly sealed. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency, applying the special dressing that would create an airtight seal, allowing the lung to reinflate. The casualties kept coming. Men with arms hanging by threads of tissue, men with abdominal wounds who clutched at their own intestines, men whose faces had been partly torn away by shrapnel, men burned by flamethrower backfire or cooking fires ignited by enemy rounds, men in shock, their eyes vacant and staring, men who whimpered like children, men who cursed with every breath, men who prayed. Woodson treated them all. Between patients, he would glance down at his own legs, checking that the blood seeping through his trousers was not flowing too freely. He could feel his strength beginning to ebb, a gradual weakening that he fought with sheer force of will. There were too many men who needed him. He could not afford to collapse, not yet. The tide continued its inexorable rise, pushing more landing craft toward the beach. Each wave brought fresh troops and fresh casualties. The German defenders, dug into their concrete bunkers and fortified positions, maintained their devastating fire. American soldiers died in the surf, on the sand, at the seawall. The battle for Omaha Beach hung in the balance, success far from certain, yet amid the chaos and carnage, small victories emerged. A man who should have bled out survived because Woodson's tourniquet stopped the hemorrhaging. A soldier who would have drowned in his own blood breathed easier after Woodson cleared his airway. A young private who faced amputation kept his mangled arm, because Woodson splinted it properly and controlled the bleeding. Around mid-morning, as the battle raged into its 6th hour, Woodson heard shouts coming from the water. He looked up from the soldier whose compound fracture he was splinting to see 4 men thrashing in the surf approximately 50 yards offshore. Their landing craft had struck a submerged obstacle, one of the thousands of iron and wood barriers the Germans had planted beneath the waterline, and capsized. The men wore full combat gear, 60 pounds or more of equipment that dragged them down like anchors. Woodson stood, his wounded legs screaming in protest. Around him, other soldiers hugged the sand or crouched behind obstacles, unwilling to expose themselves to the machine gun fire that still swept across the beach at irregular intervals. The men in the water were drowning. Woodson could see their arms flailing with increasing desperation, their heads dipping below the surface for longer periods with each struggle. Without hesitation, Woodson moved toward the water. Each step sent fresh blood seeping from his wounds. The shrapnel embedded in his flesh ground against muscle and bone, but he had taken an oath to preserve life, to render aid, to never abandon those who needed him. That oath did not include clauses about personal safety or convenient circumstances. He waded into the surf, the cold water shocking against his damaged body. The weight of his own medical kit tried to pull him down, but he pushed forward. The first soldier he reached had already gone under. Woodson dove, his hands searching through the murky water until they found fabric. He pulled, breaking the surface with the unconscious man in tow. Getting him to shore required every ounce of strength Woodson possessed. His legs barely functioned. His arms felt like lead. But he dragged the man onto the sand and began resuscitation efforts, pressing on his chest until seawater vomited from his mouth and he gasped for air. 3 more men remained in the water. Woodson went back. The second rescue proved even more difficult. The The soldier panicked, grabbing at Woodson and threatening to pull them both under. Woodson had to strike him, a quick blow to stun him into compliance before he could tow him to safety. The third man had already drowned, his body floating limply. Woodson brought him in anyway, attempting resuscitation for 10 minutes before accepting the inevitable. The fourth soldier had managed to grab onto a piece of floating debris and was barely keeping his head above water. Woodson reached him just as his grip began to fail. Together they struggled back to shore, Woodson's vision beginning to gray at the edges from exhaustion and blood loss. He collapsed on the sand beside the man he had saved, both of them gasping like beached fish. 60 seconds later, Woodson was back at his aid station, treating a soldier whose leg had been nearly severed by a shell fragment. There was no time to rest, no time to acknowledge his own deteriorating condition. The wounded continued to arrive in an endless, bloody stream. The morning stretched into afternoon. The character of the battle began to shift as American forces finally began to gain footholds on the bluffs above the beach. Engineers blasted paths through the German obstacles. Tanks crawled ashore. Artillery batteries established positions and began counter-battery fire against the German guns. The withering fire that had turned the beach into a slaughterhouse gradually diminished. But the casualties did not stop. If anything, they increased as more units pushed inland and engaged the German defenders in close combat. Men came back from the heights with fresh wounds, some walking, some carried on stretchers, some dragged by exhausted comrades. Woodson's aid station became a crucial node in the evacuation chain, the place where initial emergency treatment stabilized men enough to survive transport to the hospital ships offshore. Woodson worked through it all, his hands moving with mechanical precision even as his body began to fail. Other medics had established their own aid stations along the beach, but Woodson's drew a steady stream of casualties because word had spread. There was a medic near the seawall who could work miracles, who could save men that others would have written off, who never seemed to stop or rest or give up. By early afternoon, Woodson faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A young soldier, no more than 19 years old, lay before him with his right arm crushed beyond any hope of saving. The limb had been caught beneath a collapsing section of Higgins' boat when a shell had struck the craft. Bone protruded through shredded flesh. The hand hung at an impossible angle. Blood loss had already driven the soldier into shock, his skin pale and clammy, his breathing rapid and shallow. Under normal circumstances, this soldier would have been evacuated immediately to a hospital ship where surgeons could perform the amputation under controlled conditions. But these were not normal circumstances. The beach remained under sporadic fire. The evacuation ships were overwhelmed with casualties. Transport craft were hours away. The soldier was dying, bleeding out despite the tourniquets Woodson had applied. If the arm remained attached much longer, infection and blood loss would kill him. Woodson had been trained in emergency amputation procedures, but training was vastly different from reality. His hands, which had remained steady through hours of trauma care, trembled slightly as he laid out his instruments on a piece of canvas. A scalpel, a bone saw, clamps, sutures, morphine. Though supplies were running dangerously low, he administered what he could to the soldier, knowing it would not be enough to fully block the pain of what was coming. 2 soldiers held the young man down as Woodson began to cut. The procedure had to be done quickly. Every second of delay increased the risk of fatal blood loss or shock. Woodson worked with grim determination, cutting through tissue, clamping blood vessels, sawing through bone. The soldier screamed despite the morphine, his back arching against the hands restraining him. Woodson forced himself to focus on the technical aspects of the procedure, to think of the arm as a problem to be solved, rather than a piece of a human being he was removing forever. The amputation took 20 minutes from first incision to final suture. When it was done, Woodson had saved the soldier's life, but at a terrible cost. The young man would go home with one arm, would face a lifetime of disability in an era before modern prosthetics and rehabilitation services. Woodson wrapped the stump carefully, administered another dose of morphine from his dwindling supplies, and moved to the next patient. He would perform 3 more field amputations that day. Each one carved something away from his own soul, even as it saved a life. The decision to amputate rested with him alone, There were no senior surgeons to consult, no second opinions available. He bore the weight of those choices in solitude, knowing that he was permanently altering the lives of the men under his care, but also knowing that the alternative was death. Between amputations, he continued treating the endless flow of other casualties. A soldier with a bullet through his shoulder, another with shrapnel in his thigh, a sergeant whose eardrum had been ruptured by a close artillery blast, a lieutenant whose face bore deep lacerations from flying glass. Each man received the same careful attention, the same professional skill, the same unwavering commitment. Woodson's own condition continued to deteriorate. The shrapnel wounds in his back and legs had become infected despite his best efforts to keep them clean. Fever began to set in, bringing with it waves of chills and disorientation. His hands developed a tremor that he had to consciously suppress when performing delicate procedures. Dark spots danced at the edges of his vision, but he kept working. Other members of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion found him during the afternoon. They had survived the landing and were establishing their balloon positions further up the beach. When they saw Woodson, bloodied and swaying with exhaustion, still treating wounded men, they tried to convince him to stop, to seek treatment for himself. He refused. There were too many wounded, too few medics. He would rest when the work was done. The work was never done. As afternoon faded toward evening on that longest of days, casualties continued to arrive. The battle had moved inland, but men were still dying. Combat continued in the hedgerows and villages beyond the beach, and Waverly Woodson Jr., despite wounds that would have hospitalized most men, continued to save lives. As darkness fell on June 6th, the character of Omaha Beach transformed from chaotic battlefield to organized beachhead. Engineers had cleared paths through the obstacles. Supply dumps were taking shape. Reinforcements streamed ashore in increasingly orderly fashion. The German artillery fire had largely ceased, the defenders driven back or silenced by American counter-battery fire. But the medical crisis continued unabated. Woodson worked by lamplight, the flickering illumination casting grotesque shadows across the faces of wounded men. The aid station had grown throughout the day, expanding from its initial depression in the sand to a more organized triage area with separate sections for critical casualties, walking wounded, and those beyond help. Other medics now worked alongside Woodson, but he remained the anchor of the operation, the one to whom the most difficult cases were directed. A soldier arrived with a chest wound that had somehow missed his heart and lungs, but had shattered 3 ribs and punctured his diaphragm. Woodson could see the muscle tissue moving with each labored breath, could see the abnormal rhythm that indicated serious internal damage. This man needed a surgeon, needed a fully equipped hospital, needed intervention beyond what a field medic could provide. But the evacuation boats were still overwhelmed, still hours away. So Woodson did what he could, stabilized the chest wall, administered morphine, positioned the soldier to ease his breathing, and prayed he would survive until proper help arrived. Throughout the night, Woodson moved from patient to patient, rechecking bandages, monitoring for signs of shock or infection, adjusting treatments as conditions changed. His own wounds throbbed with every heartbeat. The infection spreading through his body brought fever dreams that he had to consciously push aside to maintain focus. He had been awake for more than 24 hours. He had been working under combat conditions for 16 hours. His body was shutting down. Yet he continued. A soldier whose tourniquet had loosened began bleeding again. Woodson tightened it, possibly saving the man's life. Another casualty went into convulsions from a head injury. Woodson stabilized him, preventing him from choking on his own tongue. A young private, barely conscious, kept calling for his mother. Woodson held his hand and spoke soothingly until the morphine carried him into sleep. Around midnight, a chaplain found Woodson slumped against a supply crate, momentarily overcome by exhaustion. The chaplain, a captain from the 1st Infantry Division, had been moving among the wounded, offering comfort and last rites. He took one look at Woodson's blood-soaked uniform and the fevered sheen on his face and ordered him to stop working and seek treatment for himself. Woodson refused. The chaplain, who outranked him significantly, made it an order. Woodson still refused. What could they do? Court-martial him for saving lives? The chaplain, recognizing the futility of the argument and the desperate need for every available medic, relented. He did, however, manage to convince Woodson to allow someone else to change the dressings on his back wounds. When the old bandages came away, the chaplain blanched at what he saw. Angry red streaks radiating outward from the shrapnel wounds, clear evidence of spreading infection. The chaplain cleaned the wounds as best he could with the limited supplies available and applied fresh bandages. Then he brought Woodson water and a ration bar, forcing him to consume both. For 10 minutes, Woodson allowed himself to rest. Then he stood and returned to his patients. The night brought new challenges. Soldiers who had seemed stable during the day took sudden turns for the worse. Shock set in hours after initial injury. Infections began to manifest. Men who had been holding together through sheer willpower finally allowed themselves to feel their pain and began to panic. Woodson moved through the darkness, a calm and reassuring presence, treating complications, preventing deaths, providing comfort where medicine could do no more. He found himself thinking of his wife, Joanne, back in Philadelphia. They had married just months before his deployment overseas, had barely begun their lives together before the war tore them apart. He thought of his parents, of the neighborhood where he had grown up, of the certainty that if he died on this beach, many people back home would never know what he had accomplished here. African-American soldiers rarely made the newspapers. Their heroism went largely unrecognized. But Woodson pushed these thoughts aside. Recognition did not matter. Only the work mattered. June 7th arrived with gray skies and a cold drizzle that turned the beach into a muddy expanse. Woodson had now been awake and working for more than 30 hours. His body had moved beyond exhaustion into a strange state of mechanical functioning, where his training and muscle memory carried him forward even as conscious thought became increasingly difficult. The infection in his wounds had progressed to the point where he could no longer stand without support, so he treated patients while sitting or kneeling in the mud. The arrival of dawn brought the formal medical evacuation system into fuller operation. Hospital ships offshore were now accepting casualties in organized fashion. Amphibious vehicles designated as ambulances began shuttling wounded men from the beach to the ships. Surgical teams had established more sophisticated aid stations further inland. The desperate improvised medicine of D-Day was giving way to more structured care. A major from the 1st Army Medical Corps arrived at Woodson's aid station around 0700 hours. He had come to coordinate the evacuation of casualties and to assess the medical situation on the beach. What he found shocked him. A black medic, obviously gravely wounded himself, still treating patients after a day and night of continuous work. The major watched Woodson dress a compound fracture with hands that shook from fever and exhaustion, watched him speak calmly to a soldier who was weeping from pain, watched him move to the next patient without pause. The major made it a direct order that Woodson cease working and accept evacuation for his own wounds. This time, Woodson could not refuse. His body had finally reached its absolute limit. He had treated his last patient. He had given everything he had to give. As 2 soldiers helped him to a waiting ambulance craft, Woodson looked back at the aid station where he had worked for so long. Other medics were now handling the casualties. The system was functioning. He was no longer indispensable. The trip to the hospital ship exists in Woodson's memory only as fragments. The rocking motion of the craft on the swells, the gray sky overhead, the smell of diesel fuel and blood. He lost consciousness before reaching the ship and did not wake for 12 hours. When he finally opened his eyes, he found himself in a clean bed aboard the USS Normandy, surrounded by the ordered efficiency of a properly equipped hospital ward. A Navy surgeon examined his wounds and shook his head in disbelief. The shrapnel had to be removed surgically. The infections required aggressive antibiotic treatment. Woodson had lost a dangerous amount of blood. He was suffering from severe exhaustion and dehydration. The surgeon wanted to know how long Woodson had worked after being wounded. When told the answer, he simply stared. Woodson spent 3 weeks aboard hospital ships and in field hospitals before being deemed fit enough to return to duty. During that time, he learned more about the overall scope of D-Day, the 50,000 Allied casualties, the establishment of the beachhead, the beginning of the drive toward Paris and Berlin. He learned that Omaha Beach had been the bloodiest of the landing zones, that the outcome had hung in the balance for hours. that small acts of courage by individual soldiers had made the difference between success and catastrophic failure. He also learned that his actions on June 6th and 7th had not gone unnoticed. Fellow soldiers had reported what they had witnessed. Officers had documented his care for casualties. The major, who had finally ordered him evacuated, had written a report praising Woodson's heroism and recommending him for recognition. The machinery of military bureaucracy had begun to turn. But that machinery turned slowly, and it turned with built-in prejudices. Woodson was an African-American soldier in a segregated army. The rules and customs of that army strictly limited the recognition that black soldiers could receive. The highest military decorations, the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, were theoretically open to all soldiers regardless of race. In practice, however, they went almost exclusively to white soldiers. Woodson's commanding officer in the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion submitted paperwork recommending him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation moved up the chain of command, gathering supporting statements and testimonials along the way. Eyewitnesses provided accounts of Woodson's actions. The chaplain who had tried to make him stop working wrote a passionate endorsement. The major from the 1st Army Medical Corps added his own recommendation. The paperwork made it all the way to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force before disappearing into administrative limbo. No Medal of Honor would be forthcoming. Instead, the Army eventually awarded Woodson the Bronze Star with V device for valor, a respectable decoration, but one that fell far short of recognizing the full scope of his heroism on Omaha Beach. By early July of 1944, Woodson had recovered sufficiently to return to duty with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The unit had moved inland with the advancing Allied forces and was now stationed near St. Lo, providing air defense for supply depots and artillery positions. Woodson rejoined his unit as its senior medic, resuming his responsibilities for the health and welfare of the battalion's soldiers. The scars he carried were both physical and psychological. The shrapnel wounds had healed into raised ridges of tissue across his back and legs. He walked with a slight limp that would persist for the rest of his life. But the deeper wounds were invisible. The memories of the men he had saved and the men he could not save, the amputations he had performed, the 30 hours of hell on Omaha Beach. He did not speak much about D-Day. When fellow soldiers asked about his experiences on the beach, he provided minimal answers and changed the subject. The memories were too raw, too painful. Moreover, Woodson had grown up in an America where black men learned early to downplay their accomplishments and avoid drawing attention to themselves. Boasting about heroism seemed both inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion continued its mission through the summer and fall of 1944 as Allied forces pushed across France. The balloons they deployed floated above tactical positions, their cables forming an aerial barrier that discouraged German dive bombers and strafing attacks. It was technical work, important work, but far from the glamorous combat roles that filled newspaper headlines back home. Woodson treated the routine medical issues that afflicted any Army unit: infections, injuries, illnesses. He dealt with sprained ankles and cases of trench foot, with respiratory infections and equipment-related injuries. Occasionally, casualties from nearby combat units would be brought to him for initial treatment before evacuation to rear-area hospitals. Each time, the memories of Omaha Beach would surface, and Woodson would push them down and focus on the task at hand. The battalion crossed into Germany in early 1945 as the Allied advance continued. They were present when American forces liberated concentration camps and witnessed firsthand the depths of Nazi atrocity. The horror of those discoveries affected every soldier who encountered them. But for the black soldiers of the 320th, there was an additional layer of complexity. They were fighting to defeat a regime built on racial supremacy while serving in an army that practiced its own form of racial segregation. Woodson thought often about these contradictions. He had saved the lives of white soldiers on Omaha Beach without hesitation, had treated them with the same skill and dedication he would have shown to anyone. Yet those same soldiers returned to an America where they would enter through different doors, eat at different lunch counters, and live in different neighborhoods than Woodson. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across the Allied world, but for soldiers like Woodson, it brought mainly relief. The killing had stopped. The mission was complete. Now came the long process of occupation duty and eventual return home. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion remained in Germany through the summer of 1945, part of the occupation force overseeing the defeated nation's reconstruction. Woodson continued his medical duties, now primarily dealing with non-combat issues. The adrenaline and urgency of wartime medicine gave way to the routine of garrison healthcare. During this period, Woodson learned that he would be awarded the Bronze Star for his actions on D-Day. The medal was presented at a formal ceremony in September of 1945, with the battalion assembled in formation. The citation praised his heroic achievement in connection with military operations against the enemy, and noted his treatment of casualties, despite his own serious wounds. It was a recognition of his service, but Woodson knew it fell far short of what his actions had merited. Other soldiers who had performed similar feats on D-Day had received the Medal of Honor or the Distinguished Service Cross. But those soldiers had been white. The racial inequities of the award system were not officially acknowledged, but they were clearly visible to anyone who cared to look. Woodson accepted his Bronze Star with quiet dignity and moved forward. In November of 1945, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion received orders to return to the United States. The men boarded transport ships for the journey home, the same journey they had made in reverse years before. This time, however, they traveled as victors returning from a won war, rather than soldiers heading toward an uncertain future. The transport ship docked in New York Harbor on December 3, 1945. Woodson stood at the rail as the Statue of Liberty came into view, feeling the complex mixture of emotions that every returning soldier experiences: relief at survival, pride in accomplishment, apprehension about civilian life. For black soldiers, there was an additional layer of uncertainty. What kind of America were they returning to? The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was processed through Camp Kilmer in New Jersey. Woodson received his discharge papers on December 15, 1945, officially ending his service in the United States Army. He had entered the Army as a young man uncertain of his place in the world. He left as a combat veteran who had saved hundreds of lives under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Woodson returned to Philadelphia and to Joanne, his wife who had waited faithfully through 3 years of war. They reunited in a moment of overwhelming emotion, years of separation and worry dissolving in an embrace. Joanne had followed news of the war obsessively, had known that Woodson had been at Omaha Beach, had lived with the knowledge that he might not return. Now he was home, scarred, but alive. The transition to civilian life proved difficult. Woodson had trained as a medic, had developed considerable skill in trauma care and emergency medicine, but the medical profession in 1945 America remained largely closed to African Americans, except in service to black communities. The great hospitals would not hire him. Medical schools were still predominantly white. The options available to a black veteran, regardless of his accomplishments, remained severely limited. Woodson found work at a Veterans Administration hospital, treating former soldiers whose wounds, physical and psychological, persisted long after the guns fell silent. It was meaningful work, but it felt small compared to what he had done on Omaha Beach. He had saved 200 lives in 30 hours during the greatest amphibious invasion in human history. Now he dispensed medications and changed bandages in a VA hospital ward. He and Joanne built a life together. They had 3 children over the following years. Woodson worked steadily, providing for his family with the same dedication he had shown in his military service. He attended church regularly, participated in veterans organizations, and became a respected figure in his community. But he rarely spoke of D-Day. The memories remained locked away, too painful and too personal to share. The post-war years brought gradual progress in civil rights. President Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948. The Supreme Court struck down school segregation in 1954. The civil rights movement gained momentum through the 1950s and 60s, but recognition for black veterans of World War II came slowly, if at all. historians began to document the contributions of African American soldiers in the war effort. Books and articles highlighted units like the Tuskegee Airmen and the all-black 92nd Infantry Division. But the story of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion and Waverly Woodson's heroism remained largely unknown. The official records existed, buried in military archives, but they had not entered the public consciousness. Woodson watched as white veterans of D-Day were celebrated in books, films, and documentaries. He saw actors portray their heroism on screen, saw their names memorialized in monuments and museums. He felt no bitterness about this. He had not saved lives for recognition or glory, but he could not help noting the disparity, the way that history seemed to have room for only certain kinds of heroes. In 1964, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, Woodson attended a veterans reunion in Washington, D.C. He met other survivors of Omaha Beach, men who remembered that terrible day with the clarity that traumatic memories retain across decades. Some of them recognized him, remembered the medic who had worked tirelessly despite his own wounds. They shook his hand and thanked him for what he had done. It was a private recognition, meaningful but limited. Decades passed. Woodson retired from his work at the VA hospital in 1979 after 34 years of service to veterans. He and Joanne moved to a quiet house in the suburbs of Philadelphia, enjoying their grandchildren and the peaceful rhythms of retirement. But the question of recognition for his D-Day heroism never fully disappeared. In the 1980s, researchers began uncovering evidence of systematic racial discrimination in the military awards system during World War II. Studies showed that not a single African American soldier received the Medal of Honor during the war, despite the service of over 1 million Black Americans in the armed forces. The statistical impossibility of this situation pointed to institutional racism in the recognition process. In 1993, the Army commissioned a formal review of Black soldiers who may have been unfairly denied the Medal of Honor during World War II. Researchers combed through military records, looking for cases where African American soldiers had been recommended for the highest decoration, but received lesser awards instead. The study identified several clear cases of discrimination and recommended retroactive upgrades. Waverly Woodson's case came to light during this review. Researchers found the original Medal of Honor recommendation submitted by his commanding officer, complete with eyewitness statements and supporting documentation. They found the testimonials describing his 30 hours of continuous medical care, his treatment of approximately 200 casualties, his rescue of drowning soldiers, his field amputations, all performed despite severe wounds that should have taken him out of action. The case seemed clear-cut. Woodson had performed actions that met or exceeded the standards for the Medal of Honor. White soldiers had received the decoration for similar or lesser feats. The original recommendation had been submitted through proper channels and had simply disappeared into administrative limbo. The researchers recommended that Woodson be awarded the Medal of Honor retroactively. However, the process stalled. Army regulations required that Medal of Honor recommendations be submitted within 3 years of the action for which they were being awarded, with limited exceptions. Woodson's case had occurred 50 years earlier. The bureaucratic machinery that had failed him in 1944 now created new obstacles in the 1990s. The review process dragged on through years of administrative procedures and legal interpretations. In January of 1997, President William Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 African American World War II veterans whose heroism had been overlooked due to racial discrimination. It was a historic moment, a partial correction of an old injustice. But Waverly Woodson was not among the recipients. His case, the Army determined, did not meet the technical requirements for the retroactive award despite the clear evidence of discrimination. Woodson, now in his late 70s, watched the ceremony on television. He felt pride for the men who were finally receiving the recognition they deserved, men whose courage had been ignored for 5 decades. But he also felt the sting of continued exclusion. His actions on Omaha Beach had been documented, verified, and recommended for the highest honor. Yet bureaucratic technicalities still denied him the recognition that was his due. Advocacy groups took up Woodson's cause. Veterans organizations began lobbying Congress to pass special legislation that would waive the time restrictions and allow the Medal of Honor to be awarded. Historians wrote articles highlighting the injustice of his case. Slowly, public awareness of Waverly Woodson's heroism began to grow. But the wheels of government turned slowly, and Woodson was growing older. On August 23, 2005, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. died at the age of 83. He passed away in a hospital in Maryland, surrounded by family members who had heard stories of his heroism but had never seen it publicly acknowledged. His obituary in local newspapers mentioned his military service and his Bronze Star, but most Americans remained unaware of what he had accomplished on the most important day of the 20th century. His death brought renewed attention to his case. Veterans groups intensified their lobbying efforts. Members of Congress introduced bills specifically naming Woodson and requesting that the Medal of Honor be awarded posthumously. The legislation moved through the usual committee processes, gathering supporters but also facing opposition from those who worried about opening the door to unlimited retroactive awards. Joanne Woodson, his widow, became an advocate for her husband's recognition. Despite her advanced age, she attended hearings, spoke to reporters, and kept pressure on elected officials. She had lived with Waverly's memories of Omaha Beach, had seen how those 30 hours had marked him for life. She wanted the world to know what he had done, wanted his grandchildren and great-grandchildren to understand the depth of his heroism. The fight for Waverly Woodson's recognition continued into the 21st century, long after his death. His story became emblematic of a larger historical injustice, the systematic undervaluing of African American contributions to the war effort. Scholars studying D-Day began including chapters about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion in their books. Documentaries featured segments on black soldiers at Omaha Beach. The narrative of D-Day, once told almost exclusively through white perspectives, began to expand. Linda Hervieux's 2013 book, Forgotten: The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes at Home and at War, brought comprehensive attention to Woodson's story for the first time. Her meticulous research documented not only his heroism on June 6 and 7, 1944, but also the systematic racism that had denied him proper recognition. The book sparked renewed interest in correcting historical injustices against black veterans. In 2015, Representative Charles Rangel of New York introduced legislation in Congress specifically calling for Woodson to receive the Medal of Honor. The bill garnered bipartisan support, with lawmakers from both parties acknowledging the clear evidence of discrimination in the original awards process. However, the legislation faced procedural obstacles and did not advance to a vote during that congressional session. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans added an exhibit featuring Woodson's story. The Smithsonian Institution included information about him in displays on African American military service. Schools began teaching about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion and the black soldiers who had contributed to D-Day's success. Woodson's name entered the historical record in a way it never had during his lifetime. In 2019, the United States Army conducted another review of Woodson's case at the request of Congress. Military historians examined the evidence once again. The eyewitness testimonies, the medical records showing the extent of his wounds, the casualty reports documenting the number of men he had treated, the original Medal of Honor recommendation. The conclusion remained the same. Woodson's actions had clearly merited the nation's highest military decoration. Yet bureaucratic obstacles persisted. The technical requirements around timing and documentation created barriers that even compelling evidence could not overcome. The Army expressed support for recognizing Woodson, but indicated that congressional action would be necessary to waive the regulatory restrictions. The matter remained in legislative limbo. Joanne Woodson continued her advocacy until her own death in 2021 at the age of 98. She had spent 16 years fighting for her husband's recognition, becoming a familiar figure at veterans events and congressional hearings. Her persistence kept Woodson's story alive and in the public consciousness. Before her death, she extracted promises from her children and grandchildren to continue the fight. The Woodson family carried forward that promise. His descendants worked with veterans organizations, historians, and elected officials to maintain pressure for recognition. They shared family photographs, personal letters, and memories that added human dimension to the historical record. The man who had saved 200 lives on Omaha Beach became real to new generations who had never known him. In 2022, 78 years after that terrible day on Omaha Beach, the Department of Defense announced that it would recommend Waverly Woodson Jr. for the Medal of Honor. The announcement came after renewed congressional pressure and a comprehensive review that determined the evidence was overwhelming, and the original denial had been rooted in racial discrimination. The recommendation went to President Joseph Biden for final approval. On the 79th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 2023, a ceremony was planned at the White House. Woodson's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered to finally see justice done. Veterans from modern wars stood alongside the dwindling number of World War II survivors. Historians who had researched Woodson's story attended. Members of Congress who had championed the cause were present. However, as of late 2023, the final approval remained pending through administrative channels. The Woodson family continues to wait, continues to advocate, continues to hope that the recognition so long denied will finally be granted. The story of Waverly Woodson Jr. remains unfinished, a testament both to extraordinary heroism and to the persistent difficulty of correcting historical injustices. But regardless of whether official recognition eventually comes, Waverly Woodson's place in history is secure. He saved approximately 200 American soldiers during 30 hours of continuous medical care on Omaha Beach, working despite wounds that should have incapacitated him. He performed field amputations, rescued drowning men, and provided comfort to the dying. He embodied the highest ideals of military service: selflessness, courage, dedication to duty, and care for fellow soldiers. The beach where he worked that day is now peaceful. Tourists walk across the sand where men once bled and died. Monuments commemorate the sacrifice of those who fought there. The American cemetery at Normandy holds the graves of thousands who did not survive D-Day. Woodson's story adds depth to that history, reminding us that heroism came from unexpected places and that many heroes went unrecognized due to the prejudices of their time. The men Woodson saved on Omaha Beach went home to their families. They raised children who raised children of their own. The lives that continued because of Woodson's skill and courage have multiplied across generations. Somewhere in America today live the descendants of soldiers who survived because a wounded medic refused to stop working, refused to give up, refused to let them die. That is Waverly Woodson's true legacy, not medals or recognition, but lives saved and futures made possible. His story challenges us to examine how we value heroism and whose stories we choose to tell. It asks us to consider how many other Waverly Woodsons exist in history. How many acts of extraordinary courage have been forgotten or dismissed because they did not fit the expected narrative. It reminds us that the complete story of any historical event includes voices that were silenced and contributions that were ignored. On Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, when the fate of the world hung in the balance, a black medic with shrapnel in his body saved 200 American soldiers. He did it not for glory or recognition, but because it was his duty, because they needed him, because it was the right thing to do. The truth stands independent of any medal or official acknowledgement. Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. was a hero of D-Day, and history will remember him as such, regardless of what paperwork says or does not say. The next time someone speaks of D-Day heroism, Woodson's name deserves to be mentioned alongside the more famous names. The next time a child learns about the Normandy invasion, they should learn about the medic who worked for 30 hours straight, despite his own terrible wounds. The next time we contemplate what courage means, we should remember the man who saved 200 lives on the bloodiest beach of the bloodiest day of the 20th century. That is the story of Waverly Woodson Jr. That is the story that almost wasn't told. That is the story that must never be forgotten.